It's time for Bring It In, troops at home from quarantine show. Today we have David Thorpe is there. I don't think you're all arranged the same way, but to me over there. And Zachary Binney, how are you, sir?
Hello. On the sliding scale that we're all grading on, I'm great. How are you guys?
relatively good.
I like
Right?
it.
All right,
I
Zach,
always feel bad saying I'm good. I mean,
know,
relatively, I'm
Relative.
extremely fortunate, but I do like to throw that in there.
like a pandemic 7 kind of thing.
Right.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, so you are an epidemiologist, assistant professor of quantitative theory and methods at the Oxford College of Emory University. Your research sits at the intersection of sports and public health, very relevant to today, focusing on sports injuries, athlete health. He's previously worked in palliative and end-of-life care and collaborated on projects related to infectious diseases. He's consulted for sports organizations, including the NFL, MLB, NBA, and NCAA Division I teams, pharmaceutical companies, and media groups on statistical and analytical issues. He's also a staff writer at Football Outsiders and enjoys working with journalists, that's us,
Yeah.
to communicate accessibly about epidemiology and statistics to the public. How's it going? We already covered that, didn't we?
Yes, we did. I can say it again.
Yeah, no, that's not necessary. All right, so you got very excited about the women's roller derby plan.
I did.
Can you tell us why?
Sure. So the women's roller derby plan was the first one that I had seen in terms of return to play plans that explicitly said, look, this is the amount of disease in the community that we are okay with. I mean, they really came at it from very much of a values-based perspective and said, look, athlete health is our number one concern. We're not worried about, how can we get back quickly? We're worried about how can we get back right. And like I said, they built that around how much disease is there in the community, because I think that's really the key important thing for bringing back anything, taking any step back towards normality, is it all depends on what the community around you looks like. If it's a disaster zone with rampant viral spread, then you're not really able to open anything back up yet. But if it gets low enough, you could argue that you could even bring back primarily indoor activities with contact, like roller derby. And I think they understand that, and they built a very slowly graduating upwards plan from no contact to thinking about how the big area that teams are coming across from. They started with keeping it local, which is exactly what I would recommend. So there were just so many good things in the plan, and it was communicated so beautifully and clearly with color-coded maps and this whole ladder. And it was just amazing that this came from an organization like roller derby, though the more I talk to people from it, the less surprised I'm realizing I should have been.
The thing I love about it is they're putting their cards on the table. Like the NBA had a press conference or like a conference call on Friday, and on the key questions of how they were going to apply the science. Well, number one, no scientist on the call, right? But number two, they assured us they had used lots of science, which is like the least reassuring thing. But also on the key decision of like under what conditions would they shut down, for instance, like is there a case rate in Florida where they shut down? And they were basically just like, we're going to make that decision behind closed doors, right? And what I love about the roller derby thing is like, no, here are the metrics. These are the criteria. You go run your roller derby all over the world based on these criteria, and it's publishable. It seems very safe and nice to publish the criteria.
Right. That's the other thing I like about the protocol is they have very clear red lines. If one case comes up, you go all the way back down the ladder. If your cases rise from where they were at the start, you either pause where you are or you take a step down the ladder. It's very clear what teams and leagues are supposed to do, as opposed to some of the other major sports leagues where it is a little more wishy-washy. And, if you've got a lot of money on the line, I think it would be naive not to think that plays in and would maybe lead you to push things a little bit further than you otherwise would. So it is nice to have those red lines.
Zach,
Yeah,
do you think the schools, you think American school systems should be creating something similar for their each, unique school zones? Forget about teams for a minute.
Right. So somebody asked me this morning, and I think it's a great question, and I can see both sides of it, because on the one hand, having red lines is really good because it holds you accountable and everybody's on the same page and you know what you're supposed to do when. On the other hand, if you're a big professional league and you've got a lot of people involved all around the country, somebody's going to turn up sick. And that's, to me, that's not necessarily a reason that you have to shut down just one sporadic, isolated case. So then you get into, well, what is the right level and risk tolerance? And I think that there's a lot of moving pieces to that puzzle. It's about the number of cases. It's about how they're distributed across teams. I'm more concerned about clusters within teams because that indicates that you have spread at your facility or in a game. I'm worried if an older person gets sick. I'm worried about the situation in the community, which the roller derby plan does take into account. But if testing percentage gets too high or hospitalizations get too high or something like that, these are all integrated pieces of a puzzle that piece together tell you whether it's okay to continue or not. So honestly, in my ideal world, you would have some where people could think about that whole, people you trust could think about that whole puzzle and synthesize everything together and make a decision on whether you can continue or not. Now, you may say, hey, making public health decisions based on a complex conglomeration of data about what should and should not be allowed and setting the rules by which we can all live from a public health perspective, that sounds like a local or state health department. And I would say you're right. I would say that I have faith in some of them, and my faith is uneven in those departments to fulfill that role nationwide, particularly for colleges and professional sports teams. And it's not the fault of anybody at those departments, but we do have to recognize that they're operating in a political environment. And in some places, that political environment is friendly to disease control, and in others, it's not. And I think it would be stupid to not think about that. So, could the SEC or could an individual school set up, or could a league like the NBA set up a completely independent board of experts who have the power to tell them to shut it down? Maybe, but there's a lot of complexities with creating a really independent board.
They're not going to do that.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I'm describing my ideal world, and you tell me that that's BS.
And also, to your point about there are real pressures on local governments, right? I just read today, like in David's in Central Florida, 25%, according to the New York Times, of workers in Central Florida work in tourism in some way. Like, it's going to be very difficult for a public official to shut down tourism in Central Florida, right? That's just a terribly difficult thing to put on the health department.
Right, it is. And, I want to say that this whole public health versus the economy binary thing that has been set up, that's a policy choice for us, okay? I know people are concerned about the debt and inflation and things like that, but there don't seem to be, I'm not an economist, but the people that I read don't seem to suggest that there's a lot of indications that that's a near-term worry. So, something like bars, well, a lot of people work at bars, right? How can we shut them down? These people need jobs. They need to make money. Well, my policy response to that is print money for them to stay closed, replace their revenue, and reduce the cost of the pandemic in terms of time lost from other workers and medical bills and ongoing symptoms and all of this stuff. I think the ROI on that is going to be pretty crazy good. So that's my preferred policy. And there's some tourism that's probably okay, right? Yeah. Outdoor stuff, you're not gathering in tight groups or large numbers, but we've got to be realistic about what's okay and what's not.
So what's your view generally of the NBA's plan? They said on Friday, basically, cases may be surging in Florida, but they're plunging ahead regardless. They think inside the bubble, safer than out, and game on. What are your thoughts?
I don't think I disagree with that yet. I am nervous relative to 2 or 4 weeks ago, for example, but I think the NBA's plan is more or less as solid as they could make it. I think it was very solid for the situation in Florida a month ago. It's maybe not as solid right now with cases spiking, because every weakness in a plan is magnified the more cases you have around you, because the baseline chance of somebody sick coming into contact with your folks is higher. So I'm nervous, but I think with the daily testing, the real restriction between interactions, any face-to-face interactions between people inside the bubble and outside the bubble, I think that has a decent chance of keeping the disease out, or if it does occasionally get in, preventing one case from becoming 10 or 20 or 100. Of course, this does rely on player and staff behavior and adherence to not sneaking outside the bubble. They set up a hotline where you can anonymously report violations. There's pretty strict punishment for leaving the bubble without permission. So I think the NBA has done what it can. It's also worked with the players' union to get buy-in from everybody, because that's what you need. You can't just top down be like, you got to do this and expect good adherence. You want to work, you want to create a climate of trust and mutual respect. And, you hope guys talk to their teammates and go, yo, if you want to go out to a strip club or a bar, I mean, you're putting us all at risk, right? This isn't just you. And hope that that's communicated really solidly. And I have hope that it will be, but time will tell. And I think that, the plan needs to be on a short leash, and we need to be keeping an eye on things.
Zach, do you think in that exact situation, so you've got Orange County, which is where almost all of Disney World is located in, and then Osceola County, which is where the Disney sports complex is. They're next to each other. So a month from today, plus a day, teams are supposed to start playing. Mm-hmm. Things are going very, very bad in Orange County, not Osceola County, it's more rural. If starting today, there was a strong push at the local level, and maybe Adam Silver did a PSA, and maybe LeBron did one, like, hey, we want to start playing games in a month. Everyone wears a mask now. There's a great chance we'll be able to play in a month, or whatever they use to inspire local people in Orange County, Orlando to do it. Would we see, do you think, in your professional estimation, a huge reduction in those positive tests being recorded in that area?
I think the bigger effect is going to be from some things that they've already started to do in Florida, like shutting down bars. Masking is great, and everybody should wear a mask. But I think it's important to remember that while it has become a political issue somewhat, and there are some very loud people who do not like to wear masks, masking is literally more popular than apple pie if you poll the two of them side by side. Okay.
Wait, so how's apple pie doing? Is apple pie pretty popular?
Apple pie is like 75, 77%. Okay. Masks are at 80. I think I saw personally, I hate apple pie, but love masks. So that works perfectly for me. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, that masking really is already quite high, though it varies a lot locally. So there are some areas where it's not anywhere near 80%, which is very concerning. I would say that the bigger concern for me with the NBA's plan is if the test positive percentage continues to rise and they don't have enough tests in Orlando, then how can you, the NBA, be sitting there on the Disney complex testing everybody every day, and there are mile-long lines of people in cars waiting to get tested and no capacity to do it? I think if you saw that kind of situation, you'd be really hard-pressed to continue the league, even if there were no new cases. If hospitals get overwhelmed, and I hope that they're not, there's no indication that they are yet, but that's a delayed indicator, so it could always change. Then what are you going to do with when your player breaks an ankle or something like that, right? They got to go to the hospital. Where are they going to go? I think these are all things that the NBA has thought about, I'm sure, but they are potential weak points. But should LeBron go down there and cut a PSA? Absolutely. Public health communication is important. People respect sports figures. I think they want the NBA back, and I certainly think it couldn't hurt.
All right, so to be clear, hold on, Henry, real quick. We'll be fast. To be clear, you're saying if you're at a restaurant and someone's serving delicious apple pie, you would just choose to wear your mask?
That's correct.
Okay.
If I had a choice between eating the pie and just putting my mask back on, I would have never taken my mask off unless I were taking a bite of food, but I would put my mask back on. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say every pie is bad. My wife made a great French silk pie the other night. I love blueberry pie, blackberry pie. It's just the apples. I don't like it.
That doesn't seem very American to me, Zach. I don't want to. I mean, it's apple pie.
Like it.
One of my favorite things. There's this movie, Thank You for Smoking, and at some point the gun lobbyist character in it has a slice of apple pie with a melted Kraft single on top of it, a little American flag on a toothpick stuck into it. And, the other lobbyists are going, that's disgusting. And he goes, it's American. Right. I was like, that's fair.
there's that movie. Now we're gonna go off the rails, and the whole title's going to hell. But that movie and lots of movies has a scene in a particular round booth with red upholstery. Doesn't really matter, except once in my life I had a drink with a friend in this little not dive bar, but like out of the way bar in LA, and they were like, "We're in that booth." It's like, this is where they shoot a bunch of movies in this exact little where that "thank you for smoking" scene happens.
It's wild.
Yeah, pretty cool. All right, so I did ask. So you get to ask, if you're a journalist on that call, you get to ask one question. My question was this exact one: is what is the plan if someone gets really sick? And the answer was, we have a partnership on the ground with Advent Health. They're going to have an on-site clinic, and if someone gets sick and needs to go to that clinic and needs to go to the hospital, they'll be able to go to Advent Health. And as Adam said, if anyone needs to leave for any reason, they're free to do so. It makes my head hurt a little bit, but like, they're trying not to take doctors and healthcare resources and tests away from the local community, but how can they not be?
I mean, if you're operating at 100% capacity in the local area and you are taking folks away, then you are taking folks away, unless they're people that you've, flown in specifically.
Even
or
then, they
something
could
like
help
that.
the people outside the gates, right?
Right, exactly, and that's the issue that I brought up with testing. Like, even if you were giving away a test for every test that you had, you still have tests, right? And if people are desperate for them, how can you keep them? I think it's a very real question that the NBA is going to have to face if the situation gets as bad as I'm afraid that it might in Florida. And we're going to have to see how that develops over the next couple of weeks. But it's the right sort of question to be asking, and I think that you're absolutely right.
Is there science around like the degree to which lots of testing eliminates the likelihood of like a super spreader event? I mean, do we know how much it works?
Yes, actually. So there was a study released just last week, and I'm not 100% an expert on this topic, but basically they were thinking about, for example, when colleges come back in the fall, how often would you want to be testing everybody in order to prevent a good fraction of cases? And in their simulations, which again, these are simulations, so they're reliant on mathematical assumptions that they put into the model. But that, based on the data that we have, daily testing would drive it down, not to zero, but to near zero. Every 3 days or so would get rid of, maybe if I'm recalling correctly, like 75 or 80% of cases. So it's going to help. And it's definitely important to do testing, because if you just wait for symptoms, some people don't develop symptoms, probably about a third according to CDC. But even if you do, we know you can spread the disease before you develop those symptoms. That's one of the things that makes COVID-19 so hard to control, is you can be spreading it and not know it. So testing is critical, but if you are doing it regularly and frequently, which you're talking about doing in pro sports leagues and some healthcare and nursing home environments, but not really elsewhere, it can cut chains of transmission for sure.
So that makes the likely. It's funny. Part of me was like, I guess the IQ test here for government leader stuff is like, we can't eliminate all spread, of course, but can you eliminate super spreader events, right? Can you eliminate, right? So you're pretty comfortable the NBA has checked that box.
Okay, so super spreader events, the real key to preventing super spreader events is not testing so much, in my mind, as not having large numbers of people gather.
Right.
That's the easiest thing. And so, would you qualify an NBA game as played in the Orlando bubble a possible super spreader event? It could be if you weren't doing any testing, but I'm confident that, keeping those numbers low and testing everyone daily is likely, not guaranteed, but likely to prevent a super spreader event. What I am more worried about popping the bubble is a couple of cases coming in from outside because so many people around you are sick, and then they just kind of spread in a locker room, or a couple guys playing video games in the same room for a few hours or something like that. That's more of what I'm afraid of than, somebody sick getting onto the court and spreading it to everybody on both teams, if that's kind of what you're asking.
Well, yeah, because that's whatever. It's going to be 50 people in the arena, but it's a 4-figure number of people living together with local workers coming and going, right? That seems like
Dr. Fauci.
The local workers, say something about the local workers. Look, 2 months ago, like when I talked to Tom Haberstroh, he's one of the first guys I talked to about any of this stuff. And he said, how do you set up a bubble to restart pro sports? And I said, you can't have anybody going in or out of the facilities where the bubble is. So like the entire hotel staff would have to be in the bubble. I have softened on that somewhat because one of the major things that we've learned about the virus is that this person to object to person transmission, it can happen, but it's not all that common. So what we're really worried about is direct contact, person to person transmission. So if you structure it so that the Disney employees never come face to face with anybody from the NBA, which I think you could do, for example, with housekeepers and food prep staff, I don't know that the risk of the disease getting in that way is all that high if you could do that. But, you know, it's riskier now that the baseline risk of one of these Disney employees being sick has gone up. And I think the NBA is now talking about maybe testing some of them less frequently. I think that's a good idea. It helps give them a little more slack in how bad the situation can get before they have to just 86 everything. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, so Dr. Fauci the other day talked about changing the way we're going about testing, and he was talking about getting into community. He didn't suggest that they had to be communities that already were suspected of being hot zones. That seemed obvious. I think he was just saying really any community. If you want to know what the community's like, get in there, test away. And yet you've already mentioned this, and I know this. I live in Pinellas County, which is 90 minutes south of Disney. They opened up testing in St. Pete, which is one of the hottest, if not the hottest city in the country right now. Sadly, it's 30 minutes south of me. They ran out of testing within 2 hours this morning. 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., done. So are we back to having testing issues? We just don't have enough tests again because we thought we had solved that problem.
Yeah, well, whether you have enough tests always depends on what the demand for tests is. We never had enough tests to test like everybody in a city on a regular basis. So it varies from place to place. And you can track that with a statistic called the test positive percentage, the number of tests that are coming back positive. You want that to be certainly below 10%, ideally below 5%.
Right.
That's sort of a rough indication that you have enough tests. You can also grade it just by looking at test sites and seeing how long the lines are, right? And that looks really bad in Arizona and Texas and Florida right now. You know, Georgia, Atlanta, when I went to get tested a couple of weeks ago, just to do my public health duty, there were 3 cars in front of me. I was in and out in 15 minutes, done. So did we have enough testing? Yes, but that doesn't mean everybody had enough testing, nor were we always going to have enough testing. So it always is going to vary by time and place. And this latest resurgence is showing the risk that, you know, you're not 100% out of the woods just because you had enough testing at some point.
Wait, can you talk me through that? Like, as an asymptomatic person, should I be getting tested?
If you have any reason to believe that you were in a situation where maybe you picked it up and
like America
and the availability is there, yes. Or if you are planning to, say, go visit a high-risk relative, I would certainly recommend getting tested a couple times before that, ideally with a very fast turnaround, and isolate yourself for, you know, at least a week before you go do that. If you went to one of the protests, we're recommending you get tested. If you came into contact with anybody who may have been a case, if you have a case in your household, even if you feel fine, yes, go get tested. If you just want it for peace of mind and there's the availability, go get tested. I'll never tell you not to go get tested unless, you know, there's a massive shortage and you have no particular reason to believe that you've been exposed. You know, like you've been staying in your basement playing video games for 2 weeks and there are 3-mile long testing lines. Like, obviously don't go out and get tested then. But otherwise, yeah, test.
What if I'm in my basement not playing video games?
You know, if you're in your basement, what you're doing, Henry, is your business. And I don't really want to discuss that further. We can move on.
How do you think the NBA could best protect their coaching staffs who are very often 55 and above?
Well, you could do 2 things. One is you could say, you know, Pop, you can't come to the bubble. right? Sorry.
They tried that.
It's too dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. And I bet Pop told him to, you said I can swear on this podcast, right?
Yeah,
well, I don't know what he said, but I'm guessing maybe it had an expletive.
Right. Go fuck yourself.
Right.
Go fuck yourself. Yeah. That's what you wanted to say. You wanted to say that, Zach.
I did. And I've already been quoted on it in the Toledo Blade. So, I'm trying to not use it too much. I want it to maintain its mystique, but sure. So you could say, listen, you can't come. You could do what the NBA has done and set up this medical panel to say, you're high risk, so we'll still pay you your full salary if you don't want to come. But they're not saying, even if you're high risk and you want to come, to my knowledge, you can still go. And so I think your job is to set up an environment that is sufficiently safe for anybody that you're going to allow in. And that means you have to have controls that are sufficiently safe for Pop or any of the other older coaches.
There's a lot.
Right. So you don't want to just design a system that is safe for Zion. You want to design a system that's safe for the person at the highest risk who's coming into the bubble. I think the NBA system is sufficient for that, but I'm definitely more worried about an older coach catching it than I am an NBA athlete. I'm worried about anybody catching it, but again, it would be just silly to say that I'm not more concerned about a coach getting it.
Are you, so let me, just to get clarification, and this may be out of your expertise a little bit, but I'm sure you have some experience. Let's say an NBA team wants to have a team meal at a restaurant and is willing to buy the whole restaurant out for X amount of dollars. But that restaurant was open during the day. You already talked about much less likely to get it through contact. But with air conditioning systems that aren't being these special surgical center kind of filters, which are very expensive, is there still a risk that even if they wait an hour and go in and never deal with the employees in the back, that they still could be some virus in the air?
That is getting a little bit outside my area of expertise. I don't want to say how long a virus could stay in an HVAC system because that's not my expertise. My sense is that if you deep cleaned all the surfaces in the restaurant or got one of those electrostatic fogging machines, that probably the risk of picking it up from a surface, and I think if you gave a couple hours, the air conditioning system, especially if you opened up all the doors and like set up fans at the doors and kind of got really good air circulation coming in from the outside, I think that the risk of picking it up from the environment would be relatively low. That's my sense. But you still got to get there. You've got to get back, and you've got to figure out a way to have no contact with any of the back of house staff. Okay, that's relatively easy, but what about like servers, right? It's just you're adding this risk, and is it really worth it? To me, I don't think that it would be. I think that the NBA is the NBA, and I sense that they could get pretty much any food they wanted inside the bubble. I know that people are going to want to leave, but I would prefer if everything just stayed on site.
Well, and also like just that dinner is dangerous for the people at the table. For me, there's nothing to say one person at the table doesn't have it, or you know what I mean? And then that's your event where the whole team gets it, right? Like,
right. I mean, I would definitely.
The waiter who's inherently dangerous, it's every person, right?
Right. I mean, hopefully, if you're testing everybody every day, then the idea is that interacting within the bubble is relatively low risk compared to interacting with anybody outside the bubble. So, you want to limit large group gatherings, but my understanding is that you're not limiting groups of, 4 guys getting together to play cards or something like that. Or, okay, you've banned doubles ping pong.
They did ban doubles ping pong. So.
I get it, but you're still you're going to be gathering in small groups. Okay, that's going to happen. And I don't think that that's crazy. These guys are not going to live. I mean, I was going to say live like monks, but it's even worse than that. Live like you're in solitary confinement most of the time. I don't think that's reasonable, nor do I think it's necessary if you've created this really insulated bubble of people who are not having contact outside that bubble and you're testing them every single day. I think that that's reasonable. So I don't know that I'd be super worried about 4 guys around a table having a meal together. I would be worried if you got to 50 or 60, right? You want to keep the gathering sizes reasonable.
How many? So the NBA said if they get some positive tests, which I guess we all have to anticipate there will be some, they will keep going.
Yep.
And there's a number that we don't get to know, but if it reaches a certain number of positive tests, then they would think about not keeping going. But they have a published schedule. How many positive tests are an acceptable number of positive tests in the bubble?
I think it, again, an epidemiologist's favorite answer, it depends. What I'm going to be looking for is clusters on teams. So, right, they did 302 tests so far in the initial round. We haven't gotten any reporting beyond that that I'm aware of, though maybe something broke this morning. I haven't been watching the news. They had 16 positive cases across the 22 teams. The highest number were 3 or 4, depending on the reports you get. I'm still a little confused about that on the Kings, but 2 of them picked it up theoretically while practicing elsewhere in other areas. So you really didn't have a cluster on a team. So what that suggests to me is that this is just cases picked up in the community, right? And not the NBA's fault or the fault of any of their protocols. So that was really encouraging and basically about the best the NBA could have hoped for. But what I'm going to be watching for once they get in the bubble are clusters. If you get to 3 or 4 cases on a team in rapid succession, I think you'd have to shut that team down. If you saw clusters on multiple teams, you'd have to think about scramming the whole thing. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. You would also be worried if you saw like 6 or 7 cases suddenly, even if they're all on different teams, because that virus got into the bubble somehow. And was that everybody's room was cleaned by the same housekeeper? Was this a group of guys from different teams who went out to a bar or a nightclub or a strip club or whatever and didn't get caught? What was this? So that's where you have to do some really like classic gumshoe epidemiology to figure out what's causing that, and is there a need from whatever happened to shut the league down at that point.
Wait, are you available in like the trench coat with the magnifying glass to be the gumshoe epidemiologist? That would be fantastic.
For the right amount of money, I'm available for anything. I'll put on whatever costume you want.
That is how it works, right? You have to have a trench coat.
Do we?
No. We dress business casual, and we go out and we ask you, what did you do? What have you been doing for the last few days? Who have you had contact with? We may not even go out. We'll probably be trying to get you on the phone and just talk to you. It's not nearly as cool as it sounds, but it's incredibly important work.
David, I know you have a question. Doesn't it drive you nuts? It drives me nuts that, like, wait, do you remember where you've been when everyone's carrying a tracking device everywhere they go these days? And I'm like, can we not, I know our privacy has been raided for all kinds of reasons, mostly to do with advertising and making more money. Now we want to save lives with that data. Can we use it, please?
Yeah, I mean, you always in public health, you need to balance privacy with, right? It would be great for public health if I could track every single person's phone and where they've been and who they've been in contact with. But again, you do have to balance that with privacy. So at this point, you would want to get NBA players to agree to that. And I don't know that in a situation like the NBA, which is, it's a lot of people, but it's still relatively small in the scheme of things. I think we could track you manually without worrying too much about that. But if we can use the magic wristbands or whatever that you are wearing to figure out immediately, hey, you've been in contact with these people, that speeds up the process, that lets us cut the chain of transmission more quickly. And if everybody agrees to that, and I think they should have a chance to not agree to that, then yeah, that's going to help for sure.
Do we have any evidence that there's been positive tests once leagues resumed, like in the German soccer league, German basketball league, the Spanish league is just finished having tomorrow. They had 10 teams, 10 teams altogether. Actually, they had 12 teams in Valencia, and they're finishing, I think, tomorrow. So I haven't read anything testing positive. Have you seen anything?
I haven't been following the international numbers very specifically. I do remember that there was 2 cases on one of the second division Bundesliga teams right at the start, and that team had to delay coming back for 2 weeks. So you definitely saw that happen. I'm not aware of any large outbreaks that forced a league to shut down once it came back, but the US has had an almost uniquely shitty response to the virus. I mean, it's like
You
us,
can say that again if you want to.
Brazil, the UK, and even the UK is appears to be running circles around us right now in terms of how they're doing. So you look at a place like Spain, which was every bit as bad as New York City ever got here, and they're able to have basketball and soccer back, and to my knowledge, there haven't been any large outbreaks within those leagues.
I haven't seen any positive. I follow the Spanish league. I've seen none, and we wrote about this last week or 2 weeks ago. I talked to a player there. It's not even on his mind at all. They're very careful. Obviously, they wear masks everywhere, to and from the bus even. There's only a couple selected parks they could go to near the arena, but he never thinks about it. The games looked as violent. It's a very physical league. The games looked as violent on the basketball court as they always have.
Right. You're not going to have that situation here in the US because the baseline risk of somebody getting sick is too high. So any successes that we've seen where things didn't get out of control, even if they had a sporadic case or two in Germany or Spain or Taiwan or South Korea or New Zealand, that's not going to be replicated here. It can't be with the environment that we're in, at least in certain large parts of the country right now. We didn't put in the work to be able to bring back sports as easily as these other countries did. And we're paying the price now with, even if you can bring them back, we're white knuckling much stricter protocols than any other country I've seen. And that's because our situation is so bad here.
There was a epidemiologically exciting sports thing that happened for me, which was, if I'm right, Korean baseball was humming along, and then there was that nightclub-based outbreak, and I think they didn't have any positive tests in baseball, but paused it anyway, just for the community spread to be right.
Right, and they did a whole lot of testing because they had the tests, they had the public health infrastructure in place, and they shut that down. That outbreak, even though it was, dozens of cases, they pretty much stopped it from spreading. And that's the kind of thing that you can do with both a functioning and free to operate public health system, and when you have a very low number of cases that doesn't overwhelm your public health system. So that was the right move by the KBO until they knew what was going on, but they were able to come back, right? Here, I think the results of something like that would probably be more extreme.
So I guess to me, like, this is all, I recognize it's all just a question of degrees of risk, but like the NBA protocol has no allowance for anything like that. And on top of that, we don't just know there was an outbreak. We know there was like dozens all around Disney, right? So to me, I'm like, we're accepting a ton more risk here, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that the NBA has nothing to say on that. I mean, they do have the one paragraph on page 86 that basically boils down to, we'll know it when we see it, when it gets bad enough, which is their plan. And I say that semi-seriously. It's not like they haven't thought about it. They just have decided not to draw any kind of red line. And I kind of understand that, right? As we talked about earlier. So yes, it is riskier to bring the NBA back in Orlando than it was to bring back the Spanish League in Spain. There is no question about that. That's why their protocols are tighter. That's why they're talking about, a bubble rather than having players live at home and playing games in home markets. And they're hopeful that it's going to work. And I'm hopeful that it will too. But, as big a sports fan as I am, I'm going to be watching, and I've got my public health hat on. And if it looks like it's getting out of control, I'll say so.
I think I'm just cranky. Like there was a meeting, right? Somebody said like, hey, look, community spread could trigger a shutdown. It's a model. We just acknowledged it's a model, what they did in Korea, right? I'm like, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to decide what we decide, right? That's a choice they made, which was one that my guess is, I don't know anything about this, but my guess is it'll be fine.
So remember, because of the looser regulations in the KBO where players were living at home,
right.
If they were all in a bubble, you could have made an argument that was unnecessary for the KBO to do. But they didn't know how exposed they were to those nightclub outbreaks. If you're really creating a largely separate system with no or very, very little face-to-face and almost zero unmasked contact between people within the league and people outside of it, I think you are divorcing yourself somewhat, not completely, but somewhat, from the situation around you. But we already discussed the reasons that it could blow up anyway, from not having hospital capacity to not having testing capacity to cases being more likely to leak in. So I half agree with you.
No, that makes sense.
Just for fun, do you think college football and NFL football are likely to see a relatively normal season like they're kind of predicting they will?
That's two separate questions.
Yeah.
College football, almost no chance. I'm super pessimistic about college football just because there's no centralized authority establishing protocols. The NCAA's medical committee and COVID-19 committee guidelines are pretty vague and loose, and don't really do enough to control spread within athletics departments. We've already seen example after example where teams that brought players back for summer workouts have completely failed to contain the virus. So including high resource programs like Clemson and Texas and LSU, I mean,
Zach's tweets on Clemson are very exciting.
Say what?
Your tweets on Clemson are very exciting.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think that their AD should resign. I think that Dabo Swinney should resign. I think their president should be scandalized. I think it may as well be a meatpacking plant or a prison. It's enraging that they haven't shut down. And at this point, you have to assume that they're doing this deliberately. I don't see another explanation.
But you think the NFL is more centrally organized?
Yes. To get back to that, so the NFL has more resources. They're more centrally organized. The league can, within reason, say all teams have to do this, which is a responsibility that the NCAA and the conferences are largely abdicating and leaving to individual colleges who have failed repeatedly, even among those who are, I applaud them for reporting that they're failing, but they're still failing. Some colleges, we don't even know how they're doing, like Ohio State, who knows, because they're not reporting numbers. So the NFL has a lot of built-in advantages there. And I'm greater than 50-50 on them being able to pull off their season. But what I'm really advocating for them is what I'm calling a home market bubble model. So like the Dolphins would book a couple hotels near the stadium, have the players and staff, and if they can incorporate them, family members, stay there and just go from there to the stadium and back, and really limit the contacts that you have between people within the league and people outside of it. Otherwise, if they try to pull off the same kind of plan that Major League Baseball is, where you're staying at home and playing in home markets, sure, you can ask people to do the right thing, but then you're really relying on adherence. And even with testing, there's a very real possibility that in areas with uncontrolled viral spread, that team is going to have so many cases that at some point it's going to have to shut down because there's going to be an outbreak. So, I'm really advocating for, if you want to be able to do something like pro sports, you've got to create a bubble, either geographically distributed or in one place where there's just no contact between people within the league and people outside of it. I think that's the only way to pull it off in the U.S. right now.
You've been pretty vocal about the risks to young athletes.
Yep.
I learned from your Twitter feed about this 32-year-old Olympic gold medal winning swimmer, Cameron Vanderberg. Is that how you say it? Vanderberg?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I don't know. I've never heard it out loud.
Well, let this be your first time. Yeah, here we go. Judy's put it up here. He says he's still struggling with serious fatigue and residual cough that he can't shake. Any physical activity like walking leaves me exhausted for hours. This is a 32-year-old Olympic gold medal winner 14 days after he got the virus.
Right. And you've seen Von Miller on the Broncos, who admittedly has asthma as an underlying condition, but said he was having breathing problems even 2 months after he got diagnosed. You had Rudy Gobert just yesterday say, hey, my sense of smell still isn't really back. So he, the first guy in the NBA, as far as we know, to have the virus, is still suffering some effects from it months later. So the risk is not zero. So when you come out and you say these are young elite athletes, they have nothing to worry about. No, say what you actually mean, which is that the risk is low enough that you know that some of these young elite athletes are going to have bad outcomes, and that's not enough to deter you from wanting to see them play. Okay? I understand that perspective, I disagree with it, but that is the intellectually honest thing to say, is to acknowledge that the risk isn't zero, but that it's not enough for you to not want them to play for you. There can be long-term effects of this virus that we don't understand, but there is some concerning evidence of possible long-term lung and organ damage, which could be devastating for an elite athlete. This virus has only been around in humans, as far as we know, for about 7 months. So if you ask me what happens 9 months after you get the virus, that's knowledge that literally doesn't exist in the universe. I can't possibly tell you that one way or the other. And I think it is important to acknowledge that uncertainty. But also more than that, that the biggest thing for me is that you're still creating more cases in the middle of a global pandemic. So what the hell is wrong with you? You don't want to do that because your personal choices are not just your personal choices. These athletes can spread the virus to older coaches or athletic staff members or family members. That doesn't strike me as a good idea. So I don't want to get anybody sick who doesn't have to be sick. And that's where the idea of risks and benefits come into play. And, what do we have to have open and return, and what can we keep on ice? And I think college sports is probably one of the things that maybe should be put on ice, at least for the summer. I think it's different when you get into the fall, because then you're coming to campus not just to play a game. You're coming there for academics too. And there's something to be said for there being some value there. I think the benefits are higher when you're just layering athletics on top of already being on campus. I don't know where I fall on whether we should have college in the fall. I really don't. It's a hard question, but I think it's more defensible to have athletics then. It's just unfortunate for football that they're a fall sport that requires summer workouts, and I don't think those should be going on right now.
That's fantastic stuff, Zach.
Yeah, really.
That's fantastic. Just the way you laid it out. My kids are starting school. My son in a day now, and he plays college sports, and my daughter, his twin sister, starts in August. And you laid it out. It's hard. There's arguments on both sides, and I think you laid it out better than I had thought about in my mind, so I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Just to maybe my personal experience will be helpful. Look, I'm an epidemiologist. I work at Emory, which has a world-class public health school, literally next door to the CDC. Yeah. We have access to as much testing and PPE as we need. I am doing one of my classes online, which is an introduction to R class, which is very easy to teach online. But my other class is an intro to scientific methods that I want to try to do in person. But we have very small class sizes where I'm at. Our biggest class is 28 students. We're opening up event spaces where, that would normally take 100 people. And so maybe we'll be putting 25 people in a room for 100 and teaching that way. Everybody will be wearing masks and or face shields. So, I think it's worth a shot for us to try, but we also have a lot of things going in our favor, our attachment to Emory and the fact that our class sizes are very small. When you look at state institutions, I think it's a lot harder. And I'm definitely worried that we're going to see a lot of outbreaks on college campuses.
They're trying to move. The big schools are trying to move small classes, just what you said, into bigger classrooms.
Right.
And the big classes that you can't move will be virtual.
Right. And I think that that's not a crazy thing to try, as long as you are coming in with some flexibility and an understanding that, best laid plans of mice and men. Right. Things are going to change. You have to maintain flexibility, and you can't be bullheaded and just say, we're going to stay the course no matter what. That's the worst thing you could do, one way or the other. Like deciding not to have it no matter what, even if we looked like New Zealand, like that would be crazy. Deciding that we're going to have in-person classes no matter what, even if things look like Texas or Arizona do right now, that's insane. Like both of those are insane. So be flexible and adaptable. That's my best advice.
My favorite thing is seeing people doing innovating different ways to do stuff. And I know there've been a lot of efforts to move things outside that aren't normally outside, but it's inspiring to see. I feel like, yeah, good job guys. You figured it out. Like it does feel so much safer. Like obviously there are days you can take your class outside, right? When the weather cooperates.
Right. Great point.
Yeah. If I've got a class, and that's something I've thought about, really, the reason I want to have intro to scientific methods in person is because I think there are some really important discussions to have about specific topics, but where in a previous semester I might have, given a whole lecture, maybe I'll try to put half the lecture online and say, look, come. We're probably only going to stay about half the time. If I don't need to have a screen behind me, then yes, let's go out to the quad. Let's sit here and let's have a discussion about these issues. As many of you as possible, bring your laptops, and let's talk about this stuff outside. As long as the weather is decent, I think that's great. My absolute favorite adaptation so far, I don't know about you guys, has been the priests with the water guns. I really hope that sticks around. I definitely want priests with super soakers to be a post-pandemic thing.
I read a story this morning. I'm not sure if I learned about it from you or your Twitter feed, but about the YMCA has been taking care of like 40,000 kids, I think, this summer with almost no spread. I mean, the data is a little iffy, but they have like groups of 9 kids, and everyone, well, not everyone wears a mask, but they've figured out some protocols, and there seems to be, to the extent there have been positive tests, it's very little of it has been within the group. So I feel like, oh my gosh, Americans actually can organize a thing that works pretty well. Like, yeah, that's great to hear.
Right. There's some encouraging data. Understanding children's role in transmission has been really hard to date because children are not having the context that they normally do. So I think there's still a lot of risk there, and it would be a little weird to see a virus. It's not surprising that the virus isn't affecting children as badly, but to see them less liable to even be infected or to spread it would definitely be, the sense I get from the experts I talk to is that's weird. Yeah. So we're kind of waiting for a little more evidence on that front, but I haven't seen the YMCA data, but that certainly sounds encouraging. And I haven't heard about a lot of clusters linked to daycare centers or camps or anything like that. Sure. But the caution that I would give to that is that might be because they're being extremely cautious.
Yeah.
Right. And so if there's even a hint that somebody is sick, they shut it down. I know that's what happened with one of my friends. His kid's daycare basically had that situation.
Right. This is Gerard Hector. We traditionally end the show with a question from Gerard, which is better than the questions you're going to have during the main part of the show. There's some analysis you could do there about how the show's organized that we could talk about another time.
Zach, this has been incredible conversation. It's always nice to talk to, have people on who know what they're talking about this stuff, right?
We can hear you, Gerard.
Not you guys. So you and Dr. Michael Osterholt from Minnesota, like you guys have all said, you're less concerned about person to object to person than you are with other things. Mm-hmm. And I know, does that includes food, right? Like you're not concerned with food so much, like it being transmitted that way. Can it not be transmitted through food?
I'm not going to say not, because if we were in the same room right now, Gerard, and you were sitting at my desk with me and I coughed right over my desk, and then you immediately put your hand down to make an emphatic point and then brought it up to wipe your nose, yes, you could absolutely get sick. This is not something that can't happen.
Right.
This is something that in the
wild.
A
piece of apple pie.
Well, I would throw that in the garbage immediately because it's a garbage pie, as we've discussed many times, Henry, and I don't know why you insist on bringing this up again.
So that's safe. That's what you're saying. That's safe. Sounds safe.
It could happen. I'm just saying in the wild, we don't seem to see that happening very frequently. It's much more concerning for you and me to be close to each other at the desk because we're breathing in each other's vicinity. And even when I talk, I produce a fine mist of droplets that you can inhale and will inhale. That is much more concerning than the person to object to person transmission. That doesn't mean it's zero.
Right.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about washing hands or hand sanitizing or anything like that. It just means that that's a little bit less of a concern. And so that's why food service, as long as you can keep everybody separated physically is less of a concern to me. But that said, it's also kind of an interesting thing in epidemiology. And I heard Dr. Carl Bergstrom make this point on a podcast just yesterday, is that in the middle of a pandemic, when you know how much spread there is, it's almost like there's no good news. Because if we learn that person to object to person transmission is not a big deal, that means we know that person to person respiratory droplet spread is an even bigger deal than we thought. So, it's good in some ways and bad in others. I would say that the person to person spread is a little easier to control than the person to object to person spread. So it's good on balance, but yeah, that's what I would say about that. Does that answer your question, Gerard?
It does. And when you're looking at it though, right? So to your point, keep the food service people separate, because I look at like what's going on here in New York and everywhere. But as people start becoming lax with their rules and cases increase, that person to object to person, that chance does increase though, right? Like,
Right.
Okay.
Sure. You know, the more sick people you have and the less careful that they are being, the higher risk there is of transmitting in any way. Yes, I would agree with that 100%. But, you know, if you're a league, or if you're just you and you're focusing, you know, we all only have a finite amount of energy and resources, right? So if you're trying to figure out how to reduce your risk of contracting COVID-19, I would much rather have you focus on not going to a bar than I would on keeping your groceries outside for 2 days. Right. I don't think that's necessary anymore. And we really want to focus on these big areas of spread, because that's where a lot of the benefits are going to be. So if I had only 2 pieces of advice to give to people, it would be these. Avoid extended time indoors with crowds, and wear your fucking mask.
Now you sound like me. Wear your fucking mask.
Well, you guys saw that article in the Journal today, right? About like Hong Kong and like all the amount of people that live there. And they're like, oh, only had so many. I'm like, so the net from this whole article is wear a fucking mask, and that'll solve like so many problems. It's pretty simple. I don't know.
My sister-in-law has flown to Hong Kong. She's a pilot, so she's flying there very frequently with United, mostly cargo. And they interview you before you go into a restaurant. What hotel you at? How long you've been there? Of course, you have to have a mask on. That goes without saying until you actually eat. But if you just flew in, they don't let you come in. You have to lie, and they are asking a lot of questions. And they sniff out the pilots who did just come in, and they send them right home. Like, they are not messing around.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Last thing I was going to ask you about is you tweeted something about, like, basically the community can pick where it's going to use its certain allowance of contact, and if you want to open schools, maybe that means you can have restaurants and bars, etc.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I think that there's this idea that I really like. I don't know if other people like it, but this idea of an individual contact budget that you have. So if you really want to go out to, like I love, one of the most important things that I like to do is tonight I'm going to go to pub trivia on a bar with a patio where everybody's sitting outside. All the servers are wearing masks. I know the owner. We've texted and talked back and forth about how he could reopen safely. I think he has. And I'm going to go there, and that gives me some contacts, but they're outside, so that costs less. There are a few of them, that costs less. They're spread apart, that costs less. But, you know, I definitely think more carefully about, but can I get takeout on Friday instead? Because I've already kind of had my contacts for the week. I want to keep that number low, not necessarily 0, because that's not realistic, but I want to keep it as low as I can. In that same way, I think you can extend it to a community where the disease spreads from person-to-person contact. So the fewer person-to-person contacts you have, the less disease spread there's going to be. That's just science. That's not debatable. Okay. So if you have a certain number of contacts above which it starts to get dangerous and below which you can keep things in control, then you want to think about how those contacts are going to occur. And if you want to have schools, which a lot of people, myself included, do, then you got to give up something else, I would say. So, you know, bars might be the thing that, hey, we can't have bars. We got to pay them to stay shut. We got to make their people whole. We got to cover their revenues, cover their payroll. That's something we can absolutely afford to do. We're the richest damn country on earth. There's no reason we can't do this, except that we don't want to. So, like, let's do this for public health and keep that budget low and think about where your priorities are, right? It's all about priorities, because we can't have everything back. Okay, sorry, you can't. I'm sorry to be that bearer of bad news. So what do you really want back? Focus on that.
Great point.
No, Zach, it's America. I want everything.
Yeah, well, I do too, Gerard. It is America. You're right.
He wants the apple pie and no mask.
I was going to say, except apple pie.
That was just sitting there. That joke was too easy. All right, Zach, thank you so much. That was super helpful. I look forward to talking again.
Absolutely. I'm always here, guys. Thanks, and take care and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, Zach.